Good evening, everyone. This is Dewana Nicole from Advancement Project, and I just wanted to thank all of you for joining us this evening for our next to last webinar for school year 17-18 on restorative justice implementation, building and sustaining effective school behavior teams. So we are once again joined by Allison Meyer from Denver Public Schools, who is going to welcome us with an opening.
Thanks, Dwana. Both of the readings I selected today for both the opening and closing are very connected to rules. So this one is called Be a Communitarian, and it's from the book The Last Lecture by Randy Pausch. We've placed a lot of emphasis in this country on the idea of people's rights. That's how it should be, but it makes no sense to talk about rights without also talking about responsibilities. Rights have come from somewhere, and they have come from the community. In return, all of us have a responsibility to the community. Some people call this the communitarian movement. I call it common sense. Everyone has to contribute to the common good. My dad taught this to us by example, but he also looked for novel ways to teach it to others. He did something very clever when he was a Little League baseball commissioner. He had been having trouble rounding up volunteer umpires. It was a thankless job, in part because every time you called a ball or a strike, some kid or parent was sure you got it wrong. There was also the issue of fear. You had to stand there while kids with little or no control flailed their bats and threw wild pitches at you. Anyway, my dad came up with an idea. Instead of getting adults to volunteer, he had the players from the older age division serve as umpires for the younger kids. He made it an honor to be selected as an ump. Several things happened as a result of this. The kids who became umpires understood how hard a job it was and hardly ever argued with umpires again. They also felt good that they were lending a hand to the kids in the younger divisions. Meanwhile, the younger kids saw older role models who had embraced volunteering. My dad had created a new set of communitarians. He knew when we're connected to others, we become better people.
Thank you, Allison. So as a reminder, these webinars are brought to you by the Denver School-Based Restorative Practices Partnership, which is a coalition of 5 organizations: Advancement Project, Denver Classroom Teachers Association, Denver Public Schools, the National Education Association, and Padres y Jóvenes Unidos, with the goal of strengthening restorative justice implementation in Denver Public Schools, but also producing resources that educators and community members across the country could use in their school communities. So today we're going to be, all these webinars are related to our implementation guide. And today we're going to be discussing items under benchmark number 2. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Allison.
Thanks, Dwana. So as far as this webinar goes, we're going to be looking about, like Dwana said, we're going to be talking about benchmark number 2 in our implementation guide, which is the benchmark that references foundational structures that support restorative practices implementation being in place. Really what we'll cover today will be 2 types of foundational structures. One, ensuring that you have inclusive and transparent policies and protocols written in the first place. And so what are your school rules? What are your school policies? What are the procedures that happen inside your building? What expectations are students and adults expected to meet? And what are the supports that are in place in order to help them meet them? And then in addition to that, how do you structure a behavior team in a way that will support the meeting of expectations? And that will also make sure that there is a way to respond when expectations are not being met in a restorative way. And so one of the reasons why it's important to have an effective and efficient behavior team, well, there are a couple of reasons, but one of the first ones is that it ensures consistency among the adults in your building. One thing that we see is a lot of times when you're in a school and the students are not following expectations, it's often because the adults in that building are enforcing them inconsistently and slowly undermining the culture of that school. I can think of occasions in my own time and as a classroom teacher where I was that person who was undermining the rules and the expectations. And I'm sure those of you that are still currently in the classroom and still very present in school buildings can think of that teacher that maybe doesn't always enforce the cell phone policy the same way the other teachers do, or the teacher who lets students use headphones when there's a school expectation that students should not be able to use headphones. And I think a lot of us know that what that typically causes within a school is, one, it's really difficult for students to have to be able to navigate which teachers are actually going to enforce rules and which ones aren't. And then frequently students will try to leverage that with the teachers that are trying to hold students to the expectations that have been agreed upon as a staff. And so I can think of times early on in my teaching career where I would be called out by a colleague who would say, you know, if you don't ask the students to tuck in their shirts, I worked at a school that had uniforms, you are undermining me, because when I ask a student to tuck in their shirt, the first response I get is, Miss Meyer doesn't make me do that. And so I think when we talk about behavior teams and when you talk about these policies and procedures, there's definitely a clear benefit for students to have those consistencies. But the reality is that a lot of this work has to be done to hold the adults in our building accountable. In any building I've been in where the adults are very consistent with the rules and the expectations, you see that consistency really trickle down to the students in the building as well. One of the other reasons it's really important to have an effective and efficient behavior team is it streamlines communication between the teachers and the administrators. One thing I can think of in particular, if you've ever had a challenge as a classroom teacher with enforcing a certain rule. So I worked in a school once where the uniform code was actually really difficult to enforce. There was a dress code. It was a list of colors, and students could wear certain colored tops and certain colored bottoms, but the colors were actually different colors. And so as teachers, it was really hard for us to remember, since the list of colors was so long, which colors students were allowed to wear on top, which colors students were allowed to wear on the bottom. And so we were able to communicate that to our behavior team. And they actually adjusted the rule in response to that, because we were able to communicate that we are having trouble being consistent in upholding this expectation. One of the other reasons it can be really valuable to have an effective and efficient behavior team is that it guarantees time and space for collaborative data analysis and review. What I see a lot in buildings when I'm in there is that data analysis and review, and particularly disciplined data analysis and review, typically happens at the end of a school year or at the end of some sort of like marking period or natural break in the school year. And a lot of times what's also being looked at is the school data that needs to be reported elsewhere. And so frequently that's looking at in-school suspensions, but more commonly it's looking at out-of-school suspensions, and expulsions, and perhaps referrals to law enforcement. If you have a behavior team that is meeting consistently, and I would say in a lot of schools that means weekly and sometimes even twice a week at the beginning, you can have a team that is analyzing data on an ongoing basis and not just waiting until these marking periods to look at the data, or at the end of the year to look at the data. And you can also ensure that this behavior team is looking at referral level data. And so data that might catch behavior trends among adults in the building, trends among students in the buildings at a referral level. And when I say referral, I mean if a teacher is just referring a student to the office before it gets to the point of a suspension or expulsion. Frequently when I review suspension and expulsion data with schools, there's this sense of there's nothing I can do about it at this point. And if we have a really strong, effective, and efficient behavior team, it means that we can catch some of those trends before they turn into the suspension, the expulsion, and the referral to law enforcement. We would hope that effective and efficient behavior teams are also taking the time to look at overall patterns of behavior, and that is patterns of behavior for both students and adults in the building. I know some of us have been in schools where they have experienced some sort of increase in a certain type of behavior among students in the school. So maybe at a middle school, you are seeing an increase in students play fighting in the hallways that is turning into more serious fighting. And this behavior team can create that time and that space where adults can be troubleshooting, figuring out what the root cause of this behavior might be, and thinking about what some of the language that we can use that will be most effective with our students and helping them understand why that we can't have 200 middle school students horseplaying in the hallway when it turns into fighting. I would say it's also really important here to be noticing patterns of behavior among staff members. I think we see a lot of peaks at certain times of year when we know our teachers are exhausted, especially those areas, and our students are testing boundaries. So especially those areas right before a break, or maybe around standardized testing time for some of our students, but thinking about where are we seeing trends as far as referrals from our staff members. And so if you see a staff member that is, for example, referring a certain type of behavior more often than their fellow colleagues, that might be a sign that as a behavior team, you need to work with that staff member around how to respond to that particular behavior. If you have a staff member that overall is referring a high level of behaviors, that might be a good sign that maybe their instructional coach needs to go in and work with that teacher around classroom management strategies. Effective and efficient behavior teams can also provide the space for big picture conversations that are needed to make sure that we don't have a team of firefighters on our behavior team, but rather a group of professionals and experts in this work that can help and support teachers in doing the proactive and preventative work that we also want to see happening in our classrooms. And then finally, having an effective and efficient behavior team ensures that there's dedicated time to discuss issues around institutional racism and oppression and their impact on the school community. The first time I presented this to this PowerPoint and these slides to a group of educators that I was working with, I was told that that last bullet point really stood out compared to the other ones. And I was suggested that I reword it, but I think it's actually really important worded the way that it is. So often, members of our school communities and the adults in our school communities are aware of issues of institutional racism and oppression, but the reality is that that conversation isn't happening about how exactly that manifests within their school building. And so that could be a time to kind of point at like how many minutes our students of color, for example, might be spending out of the classroom versus the average white student in our building. It could also be a time to discuss the weight of being an educator of color. Perhaps when you're looking at those bigger patterns of school discipline, you're seeing that you're seeing vast differences in educators of colors versus white educators in the behaviors that they're referring for or the frequency of referral. And that could help lead to a conversation around how we're seeing that institutional racism and those systems of oppressions in our school really manifest for the adults that are in our building. And finally, this one I didn't list, but it's a new favorite of mine. One thing I'm learning is that an effective and efficient behavior team can also really build community among the adults that do that type of work within a building. The same way we ask our teachers to pause instruction when there's a crisis of community in their classroom, to be able to stop and work on repairing relationships and work on building community. I want the same for the teams of oftentimes firefighters in our buildings. I've worked in schools before where you might have a team of a couple deans or restorative justice practices coordinators or social workers or assistant principals that are often putting out fires, but aren't taking the time to build community among one another. And so again, you kind of lack that consistency, and you also lack a feeling of being supported among your colleagues that are doing really similar work in the schools. And so before we can decide how you might want to structure the team that will hold your school accountable to your school-wide expectations, I think it's really important to make sure that the members of your school community are aligning what their expectations are. And so I'm going to walk you through some examples of how you might do that in your school building. One thing to think about that is you will be receiving a resource after this webinar within the next couple weeks that will walk you through the processes that you could use in your school building to actually come to these kinds of consensuses. So the first thing you want to make sure is that you have a very clear school vision and mission statements. And most schools, I find, also have a group of shared values for the school community. Ideally, I would add that these are also accessible to all stakeholders in the building. I was recently in an elementary school where some of their shared values were going to be really hard for elementary age students to understand and unpack. And so I've been in elementary schools, for example, that have used integrity as one of their shared values. And I've been in elementary schools where that works really well because there is a lot of time taken at the classroom level for teachers to really talk to students about what it means to act with integrity. But I've also been in schools where the students are not really given that access to be able to understand that value and understand what it looks like in practice in their school. And so making sure that we have a balance there and that any values that are incorporated in the school community are values that are expected for students, for staff, for parents and family members, but that are truly shared values of the school community. Again, I've been in some schools where they might have a different set of values for the adults as for the students. And I think there are definitely areas where values might look different as far as their manifestation goes for adult in an adult space and a student space. But overall, that can make it really confusing around what exactly the expectations are for members of this school community. One thing you also want to make sure is aligned again to both your values and to your school vision and mission is that you have developmentally appropriate expectations that are upholding those values of your school community. I did want to note why I put developmentally appropriate there. One thing that we see sometimes in schools is that students are held to an expectation that is below their developmentally appropriate, and sometimes also it is too advanced for the student to be able to meet given their developmental level. And so a couple examples I can give for that would be bathroom passes. At the high school level, for example, that might be something where individual classrooms might get to have the say in how students choose to go to the bathroom. I've worked in high schools where a student was only allowed to go to the restroom one time every semester in my classroom. And that is a very hard expectation to hold a high school student to, and doesn't seem developmentally appropriate because it isn't building the skill within the student of understanding when is an appropriate time to use the restroom during class. I can also think about elementary schools where students are asked to line up and be silent as they're transitioning from one space to another. And in those same schools, I've sometimes seen that given room transitions and the size of the building, that students then end up being expected to be quiet for almost like 7 to 10 minutes. And we think about developmentally appropriate. Is it really appropriate for us to ask a 6-year-old to stand in silent by their friends and not speak for 7 to 10 minutes? Same thing around tardy policies. This is a really common one, especially if you are living in a school community where a lot of adults are the people who are bringing their students to school. I've been in elementary schools and lower middle schools that had some high consequences for students being tardy to school. When it frequently was the student's parent who had control over whether or not the student was on time. And so thinking about what our students have within their control and what they don't, and if the expectations need to be shifted accordingly. Another thing we want to make sure that a school has before they're really starting to think about what the role of their behavior team is documented supports that will help students uphold those expectations. And so if we think about the social discipline window, if we are having a restorative school, we have both a high level of expectations and a high level of support in helping our students meet those expectations. I worked in a school once that was having issues with tardies, and this was at the high school level. And one thing that they started doing as a way to support students in meeting that expectation was during the 5-minute passing period, they added a second bell. And so the first bell would ring, and then at 4 minutes, a 1-minute warning bell would ring, and then at 5 minutes, the final bell would ring. And that was a way where the school added a very simple support to help students in meeting the expectation of getting to time on class without taking away that really valuable social and brain break time for students by restricting maybe how they're able to access the hallways or access the lockers, or the amount of time, so that students might not have enough time to be able to use the restroom or to be able to socialize with their friends for a minute. And so that's just an example of a support that a school might choose to add in order to support students in meeting an expectation. And then finally, you want to make sure that you have systems for acknowledging and celebrating members of the school community that are upholding school values and consistently meeting expectations. I think often we're very quick to develop the systems for how we respond when someone does not meet expectations. And I think specifically around like consequence ladders that might exist in classrooms. But I think we need to be just as intentional, if not more intentional, about making sure we take the time to develop those systems that are really going to acknowledge and celebrate the adults and the students in your school community that are upholding the school values. One way we've seen some success in schools being able to really document and have these very well aligned school policies and procedures and values is by creating something that in Denver has been called a prevention and intervention manual. And so for those of you that might have visited Skinner Middle School, Skinner Middle School has one of the strongest prevention and intervention manuals that I've ever seen in a school building. And what their manual is it is a binder, a 3-ring binder, that is created by multiple stakeholders across their school community. And it documents all of the policies and the procedures and the systems of support that exist for students in that building. And they categorize them the same way we see things categorized under MTSS language or RTI language. So there are universal supports, there are targeted interventions, and then there are intensive interventions. And what this has really done is make sure that those things that are oftentimes unwritten in a school community of, this is how we go to our lockers at school, are actually documented somewhere. And it really helps hold both the students and the adults accountable to those policies and those procedures. And so at Skinner, they color code their binder. And so the green section is the universal supports. And that can include anything from procedures around how you use your locker, a cell phone policy, office hours that students can attend to get extra help from a teacher after school if they are falling behind in content. It might talk about tutoring opportunities or enrichment opportunities that students can be a part of. The yellow section then are the targeted interventions. And so the idea being that if the supports that are listed in the green section are not helping a student meet the school-wide expectations, that they might then need some of the additional interventions that are outlined in the yellow section. And so a lot of those are really low-level interventions, like maybe a tardy intervention for a student that is really struggling with tardies. So it starts to map out what kind of processes and what kind of interventions already exist within our school building that we can access. And then finally, there's a red section, and those are the intensive interventions. I would say every time I talked with staff members at Skinner Middle School about their prevention and intervention manual, they frequently cite that this section is almost never opened. But there are things in the red section where, like if a student did violate the Denver Public Schools discipline matrix in a way that led the student to be eligible for expulsion. What does that process look like? And it's very closely outlined in the manual. It might also look at what some of the intensive interventions might be for a student who has extreme mental health needs. So another example of what might be in that section would be the process for a suicide risk assessment. One thing that I will say is probably the most powerful thing about Skinner's prevention and intervention manual is that it is actually used by the adults in the building. I can think back to schools that I've worked in where I was handed a faculty handbook or even a copy of the student handbook. And it was something that I glossed through maybe the first weeks of schools and then put it on my bookshelf. And when it was collected at the end of the year, that was the first time I had taken it down. At Skinner Middle School, if you ask an adult in that building to see their prevention and intervention manual, you will frequently be handed something that has post-it note bookmarks and notes in the margin, because it is something that is constantly referred to in the school building as the way that we as adults remain consistent, so that that is one of the biggest supports you can provide for your students in order to make sure that they are able to meet the expectation that the adults have set up. One thing that Skinner does in order to create this manual, that is the reason why it is so valuable, is that they invite any school staff member to be a part of the process of its creation. And so their manual was originally created almost 10 years ago. And at first, they just brought together all of the members of their school community, of their school staff, who were interested in being a part of this. In order to help lure some people to this event, they held them over the summers and had a potluck dinner and some adult beverages for people to be able to also spend some time building community with one another. And also sometimes it can be helpful for something like this to be outside of the school campus. And they started by just having people write down what they thought were these shared policies and procedures and systems of support that existed across Skinner that weren't documented anywhere. And through that process, they were able to start with a very small prevention and intervention manual. Over the years, they continue to meet every summer, usually anywhere from 5 to 10 meetings throughout the summer. And at those meetings, they go back and review the manual and talk about, did we actually hold students to this expectation? If we didn't, why not? Is it something that's unreasonable to hold our students to? Is it an expectation that we came up with that doesn't actually put the interest of our students and their learning first? And they'll revisit the manual and go through and change it for the following school year. And again, any adult in the building is invited to come and be a part of those conversations. They are very well attended because, as you can imagine, a lot of the teachers really see the weight of coming to one of those meetings. And so even though they are over the summer and only occasionally has the school been able to get grants to be able to somewhat compensate people for their time, it is a really valuable use of time if you are struggling with some of the expectations that exist in the school and really want to have some input in what those could look like in the future. I've had the opportunity to attend a lot of those meetings, and now 10 years later, sometimes these meetings are as detailed as debating whether a word in the manual should be must call parents or should call parents after a certain incident would happen in the school building. And so it's very carefully thought out, and the language around every policy and procedure and rule in the school is very intentional to make sure that it is really prioritizing the needs of students and also helping to build the capacity that middle school students need to be able to self-regulate once they get to high school. And so a recent change that Skinner made, for example, was allowing students to actually have the freedom to choose when to go to the bathroom themselves, as opposed to having regulated bathroom passes within their classrooms. So that student, and they don't even have to raise their hand and ask anymore. There's just a sign in and a sign out sheet, because one thing they were thinking that their students were frequently going to high school without that ability to self-regulate when is an appropriate time to go to the bathroom. And so making sure that that kind of intentionality is put into the development of rules and systems and procedures can really help transform a school culture. And I think it also really helps hold adults accountable to why the rules are created. I think so often we create rules in these school spaces because it makes it easier on the adults, but isn't necessarily in the best interest of the young people. And so a couple of reasons why a school should consider investing the time into creating a manual such as this one, and especially in maintaining it, because it has been an ongoing process for a school like Skinner. One, it helps lead to intentional, consistent, and culturally responsive and transparent school-wide expectations. Of the handful of summers where I've attended these meetings for this particular middle school, so often I've heard conversations around racism or the experience of LGBTQ students be brought up so that policies and procedures can be amended to make sure they're inclusive for all students. It leads to a lot of relationship building among members of the school community. At Skinner, in its current form, their prevention and intervention manual creation process only includes staff members. In the facilitator's guide that we've created, in case this is a process that you're interested in doing at your school, we've also talked about how you could include students and family members and community members as well, in order to really facilitate some relationship building and that shared ownership of feeling like this is our school and this is what we need to have happen in our community in order to make this a welcoming and a space that's ready to facilitate learning. And also they've seen an incredibly increased level of staff buy-in into those procedures. And so rarely at Skinner do you see a teacher who's not upholding something that's written in the prevention and intervention manual, because the reality is that that person, one, was probably involved in its creation. And if they weren't, had the opportunity to be a part of it. And are frequently asked for feedback around the policies and procedures that are outlined in that manual. And so it really helps with staff buy-in, and then also the ability to hold adults in the building accountable to making sure that the policies and the procedures and the rules documented in there are actually executed. And so once you have a process where you have really solid systems that exist in your building, then you're ready to create a behavior team that can actually uphold those systems. And so I wanted to add a quick note on these next couple slides. I'm going to walk you through a process that you can use to support the development of a behavior team. But the reality is that most of you and in your schools, you probably already have a behavior team. And so the same process can actually be used to evaluate what already exists in your building. when Dwana sends out the materials after this webinar, she will also send out a form that you could use if you wanted to walk through this analysis with your team. She'll send out the slides from today, which in the notes section even cue you about what part of the form you should be filling out at different points throughout this presentation. This is something that you could do at your behavior team meeting if you're a member of the behavior team at your school, and you could even do it separately and kind of compare and contrast your answers with your colleagues so that it's a much more reflective process. And so Dwana will share that afterwards, and I've also included a sample so you could see what it might look like after you're done analyzing your behavior team. And so to start, we need to think about who is serving on our behavior team. And so this is what's outlined in front on the slide in front of you is really a dream model. And so I'll walk you through that. Ideally, and I would say especially if you are trying to transform school culture in your building, you would want to have an administrator that is present on your behavior team. And so that might be a principal or an assistant principal, but especially as you're in the beginning stages of transforming school climate from punitive to restorative, you want to make sure that you have somebody with decision-making power who is either sits on the team or is very closely tied to the team. Ideally, you might also have an instructional coach present. I think those of us that are in classrooms and those of us that are regularly in schools understand that a lot of times there is a very strong connection between a classroom that is having behavior concerns and a classroom where the teacher might be struggling with how to deliver content or how to structure lessons in a way that will really truly engage students. And so we have a tendency in school buildings to compartmentalize instruction and behavior, but a behavior team could be a great way to kind of build in that communication between the instruction team and the behavior team. Ideally, there will be social and emotional supports present, and so that might be a social worker, a school psychologist, maybe some sort of counselor that you have in your building. Some of the schools that I work with have somebody who is tied to drug and alcohol addiction, who is part of their behavior teams as well. We would want to see somebody who is representative of who can be a special education team representative. So often we see that our students with disabilities are often being disciplined for manifestations of their disability. And so having someone present who would help be able to break down a student's disability and who might also be able to encourage teachers and other members of the behavior team to differentiate the way that they ask students to meet expectations in the same way that instructional expectations are differentiated for students with disability. If your school is lucky enough to employ a restorative justice or restorative practices coordinator, obviously you would want them to be a part of your behavior team. Any sort of dean or traditional disciplinarian role that it might exist in your school. Security and SROs, if your school has an SRO, can be an incredibly valuable resource since security and SRO are often radioed and sent to an incident, and especially if a student is particularly escalated. And so for them to be a part of this team will help them really inherit the culture of the building and understanding how this building really wants them to be responding to behavior concerns. I can also think of an example in a couple of buildings I've been in before where a security officer was kept out of the loop of these behavior teams. And even though it was somebody who had the right mindset while approaching a student who was very highly escalated, if they had been in these meetings, they would have known that this particular student was very triggered by physical touch. And when the student was physically touched by the security guard, they lashed out, and it eventually led to the student being ticketed. And the security guard, that really weighed heavy on them, because for them, if they had just been involved in those meetings and been in this loop of communication around some of the students who were frequently being escalated in the hallways, they would have known that and not touched that student, which ultimately led to them getting ticketed. Ideally, you would have teacher representatives, possibly more than one if it makes sense for your school building. And so if you are a K-8, it might make sense to have an elementary school representative and a middle school representative. Even at the high school level, maybe a teacher who teaches primarily 9th graders and a teacher who teaches primarily 12th graders, to make sure that that classroom perspective is being brought to the into the behavior team meeting. Frequently, we see that our paraprofessionals And I would say especially at the elementary school level are in a lot of ways the first person that is asked to work with a student who is really struggling to meet expectations. And so making sure that there's a representative from that team who might be able to talk about where teachers are struggling as far as enforcing certain expectations and where students are struggling as far as meeting certain expectations. Again, particularly at the elementary school level, we see a lot of times that our nurses are very involved in discipline and in interacting again with students when their needs aren't being met. And so having a nurse or whoever is providing medical care in your building might also be a good person to have present. I would say oftentimes you also see that the nurse has a very strong relationship with a lot of the students, and particularly some of the students that might be at risk. And so anyone else in your building that you might think of that holds really strong and influential relationships with students, and I would also add to that anyone who holds strong and influential relationships with adults in the building, and that might be a community partner, an after-school program provider, a cafeteria worker, but anybody who has a relationship with students that could really help you understand maybe some of the root causes of behaviors that you might be seeing in your school. And so this is obviously a dream scenario. I can imagine at most schools it would be really hard to coordinate a time every week when all of these people could get together. But we'll talk through how there might be different ways that you could structure this so that these stakeholders are still involved in the process, even if they might not be able to physically be present at every single meeting of this team. And so the next piece I wanted to talk about is how the individual roles of the different behavior team members support one another. And so often what we see on a behavior team is you might put all of these people in one building together, and then ultimately all of their job ends up being responding to an emergency when it happens. And so typically we'll take these people that have all these different areas of expertise and give every one of them the role of firefighter. And so being very intentional about how the different members of your behavior team have individualized roles that are designed to support each other. And so some questions that I would ask this team to think about as they are creating this team and maybe dividing areas of labor might be, one, who on your team is doing preventative and proactive work? So often when we bring a group of people together to discuss behavior, the sole focus is on reacting to things after they have happened. And so making sure that somebody on your team is really the carrier of what can we be doing preventatively and proactively to build community in our school, to build understanding of our school values, and to help teach our students and our teachers how to meet the expectations that have been set. Thinking about who is providing mental health supports on this team, who is providing the overall vision and the big picture for what we want maybe as far as a shift in culture in our school. And so who on our team will hold us accountable to the overall vision that we have laid out. Who on the team is collecting and analyzing data? I've been in a lot of schools where students are frequently surveyed, for example. And so one school I work with, after a restorative conference between two students or between a student and a teacher, both parties are given a survey that they take about what the experience was like for them. And when I asked the school what happened with that data, no one was actually compiling the data and analyzing and presenting the data to anyone. And so it was a really great first step in thinking about how our systems and structures actually working for the members of our school community, but there wasn't that final piece needed of who is actually going to take on this task of collecting and analyzing the data. Who is supporting from an instructional coaching perspective? And so you might have somebody on your behavior team that's doing that, or you might have somebody on your behavior team that is assigned to reaching out to the instructional coach when that is necessary. Who is taking on engaging community, both youth and their families in this work? I would say a very strong behavior team might also be able to include a family member and a student. I will say that you might have to be careful with areas of confidentiality around having a family member in there if there are issues of specific students being discussed. And so thinking around that, but how can we still engage family members and students in this process in a way where maybe, they aren't attending every single behavior team meeting? Who's managing the referral system? Who is on the radio to respond to incidents in the moment. Again, I would encourage that not everyone is on the radio, because some members of your team really should be focusing on some of those more systems pieces and proactive and preventative work that can be done. Who decides the resolution after an incident? In certain schools, it might be helpful to assign just one person who's ultimately in charge of deciding the resolution after an incident, because that could help reduce some of the disparities that you might see if you have multiple people who are deciding the resolution after an incident that happens in the school building. And so maybe narrowing the group of people that are given that power to be able to decide, does this move to an in-school suspension if your school still uses in-school suspension? Does this move towards an after-school intervention? How are we going to make sure that there's consistency in the way that those resolutions are assigned? Who is the keeper of race and other issues of oppression within your school building? I think it's really important to make sure that someone in your team is assigned to that, because I think so often it gets lost. And so making sure that there is somebody who is always looking at disproportionality, who might always be looking at the race, for example, of the student referred and the race of the teacher referring, and making sure that that analysis is happening on an ongoing basis, so that conversations can happen with staff members that are supported by data that's coming into your behavior team. And who ensures that root cause is being discussed? I think so often in these meetings, it becomes this, people are tired and they're frustrated, and so it becomes a complaining session rather than a space where we're actually talking about what is causing this behavior, what is causing this emerging trend that we're seeing, what might be causing a student who's never really been on our radar before to suddenly be on our radar, but to make sure that we're really focusing our conversation around root cause and not just around how do I get this behavior to stop. And so the next thing, after you've really figured out who's on my team, what are the different roles of my team members, is figuring out how your team members are going to communicate with one another. And so starting with thinking about, first of all, how often are you going to meet as a behavior team? And so, like I mentioned earlier, it might actually make sense if your school is very early on and trying to transition from punitive to restorative. It might make sense to meet more than once a week, just because it creates that space for those really tough conversations to happen. Sometimes when I'm in behavior team meetings, I'll notice that the only thing that the team ever gets to is talking about what just happened since our last behavior team meeting. And there isn't ever that time to circle back on like, what outstanding things do we still have from a month ago? You know, a month ago, we talked about how we had this huge concern around students fighting in their classrooms. And we never really revisited that because we had so many more emergencies come up between then and our next behavior team meeting. And so making sure that you're giving yourself ample time, knowing that you can always tailor it back as things start to become more streamlined. You might also decide that maybe the whole team doesn't need to come together that frequently, but maybe some subgroups are meeting more often. And so I can think of some examples at some of the schools in Denver that are farther along in this process. They no longer have administrators present at their behavior team meetings. And instead, once every couple weeks, one member of the behavior team goes and meets with the principal and just brings things to her level that need to be brought to her level. But she's very trusting of that team and that they are able to guide the work, and they are given authority to be able to do so in the building. You also might see that maybe it doesn't make sense for the deans and the restorative justice coordinator and the mental health supports to all come together 2 times a week. Maybe instead they all come together once a week and then they meet as separate teams. So maybe the psych and the social worker and a counselor meet together at a different time of the week while the dean and the restorative practices coordinators are meeting. How is data shared among the team members? Thinking about, do you have some sort of tracker? Is it something that exists online? We can send out a sample of what a behavior tracker could look like for your school as a way that you could enter in information and it be shared on a Google Doc. And so any member of your team could reference that document to be able to know who is being referred, by who, how long are they spending outside of the classroom as well. And then also thinking about when your team does come together, what is the structure for the agenda of that behavior team meeting? And so some suggestions that you might use just to keep a very simple structure could be talking about which students are being referred most often. And that might be both in regard to individual students who are frequently being referred, but also to larger demographics. And so you might see that like our Black female students right now are currently being referred more than any other demographics. And so the conversation that follows would be around what is the root cause for this? And so there would be some hypotheses. There might have to be some going out and talking to some of the stakeholders that are involved in that. And then figuring out what supports as a behavior team you can offer to help make sure that those referrals are being reduced. It might also be that you're offering supports to the students, like maybe you are identifying that there are additional mental health supports that are needed for certain groups of students or for certain individual students. Which students are being referred that were not before? I think that is a really strong indicator and when looking at school-wide data of ways that you can catch a crisis before it happens. If you're seeing a group of students that previously have not been referred to the discipline's office or to a restorative justice coordinator, that could be an early red flag of figuring out what is happening that is now meaning that this group of students or this individual student is being referred to the office, and where can we offer support both to the adult and to the student that are involved. And then thinking a lot about trends that are happening as well. And so what are some of the rising behaviors that might be seeing happening through our school? What's the root cause of those? Again, what supports can we offer to the adults and to the students? I can give an example here. I was in a school earlier this year where it had become almost part of the school culture in a couple of the classrooms that students were physically fighting one another inside of the classroom. And so that was a new and rising behavior. It also was pretty clear that on a day where one of those fights happened, usually 4 of those fights happened. And so it was something that was definitely starting to set a culture and a tone within the classroom that was an acceptable behavior. And so one thing that behavior team was able to do was to come up with a response for how a teacher could respond if that happens in their classroom in a way where the teacher feels supported, and that might also help shift the tone of the classroom for that day so that there weren't repeat altercations between students for the rest of the day. And so ways where you can develop additional systems and plans that teachers might be able to access could also make sure that your team isn't, again, just a team of firefighters, but a team that is very intentional and can also still spend time doing proactive and preventative work. Other questions that you might think to discuss as far at your behavior team meetings might be, what have we already tried? What do adults need in this scenario? Where have we been really successful? Where are behaviors that we have really seen curb, or demographics of students where we've seen a reduction in referral rates, and what's happening there that we can replicate in some of these other situations? And so the last thing I would really encourage a school to think about as you're walking through this behavior team analysis, should you choose to do it with your teams, is how are you communicating with the other stakeholders that you were not able to include on your behavior team? And so the reality is, for example, that a classroom teacher might not have the flexibility in their schedule to serve on a behavior team. And so how then are you going to make sure that there is authentic two-way communication between your behavior team and your teachers? I think a lot of times what we'll see is like a team is making that decision, and then like a mass email goes out or an announcement is made at professional development, but there wasn't the chance for the classroom teacher, for example, to actually provide feedback and have input because they weren't present at the team meeting. And so making sure that there is that authentic two-way feedback. An example that I've seen be really successful is frequently we have teachers that meet in teams throughout the school week anyway. And so at the high school level, you might have the 9th grade teachers or the social studies teachers all meeting at some point throughout the week. And if your teachers don't have the flexibility to attend your behavior team meetings, instead you might choose to send one of your behavior team representatives to the teacher meeting so that they can both disseminate information and take back information information to the next behavior team meeting. But anything to make sure that teachers, especially classroom teachers, but any stakeholder within the building, really feels engaged in the conversations that the behavior team is having. I think frequently what we see in schools is as a behavior team might be trying to shift from punitive to restorative, teachers might not feel involved in that process or really understand what's happening and might not feel supported. And so frequently I'll walk into a school where they're in this kind of gray area where they're trying to transition from punitive to restorative. And if I ask teachers how they feel about some of the support staff and administrators in the building and vice versa, there's an adversarial relationship. And so it almost feels like they're trying to make my life more difficult, and is what you hear from the teachers about the behavior team. And if you have the behavior team, they say like the teachers aren't willing to do the work. And in most cases, that is not the reality. The reality is that both sides think that they're doing what's in the best interest of the school community. There just isn't a method of communication where both sides can actually be on the same page of that. And so thinking that really covers those first bullet points: how are teacher teams informed of these conversations and how are teacher noticings brought into this space? Thinking as well about how are we engaging families in these conversations, especially remembering that both the preventative and the reactive pieces are important to engage our families and our young people. How are we talking to students when we're trying to figure out root cause of some of these behaviors? Are adults making assumptions? Or are we truly trying to understand where our students might be coming from and why they might be struggling to meet an expectation? What other staff members engage with students regularly and should be informed of decisions that are made at the behavior team level? And how are they able to provide feedback on the next steps? And so an example might be an after-school program. If you have an after-school program and an adult is leading that work, and there are things that are being rolled out that are expectations throughout the school day, and that adult might be really struggling to have students follow those expectations after school. I worked in a school once where somebody who ran an after-school program was really struggling around the expectations around cell phones. Students were held very highly accountable to that during the school day. And then when after school time would roll around, she really struggled. And the pushback she got from students was that that's an expectation that we're held to just during school hours and during class time and not when we're in the school building. And it was really powerful for her to be able to have access, even though she was just a part-time after school employee, for her to be able to have access to conversations with the behavior team. They reached out to her knowing how much interaction she has with students, and how that time being more unstructured is sometimes really a challenging time to be interacting with students. They made sure that she was brought into these conversations and adjusted some of the expectations that they had accordingly, and some of the messaging that went home to students and families to make sure that she felt supported in upholding the cell phone policy. Also thinking about how instructional coaches are clued in to support teachers. A lot of times I think we see that there's an overlap between these two things. And like I mentioned before, they're also compartmentalized in our school buildings. And so making sure that there is that very necessary communication around, hey, this teacher has been referring a lot of students out of class, especially during the day in our schedule where we have a block schedule. And so I'm thinking maybe they might be having some challenges around engaging students for 90 minutes at a time. And so making sure there is that dialogue that's happening with an instructional coach and the behavior team. And so should you choose to do this activity and kind of walk through these questions and complete the analysis chart that Dwana will send out following the webinar, I also wanted to include some questions that you could ask your team members as you finish the analysis and you're reflecting on it. And so the first question would be, does our behavior team actually support the needs of our students? And does it support teachers and other staff members in our school in serving the needs of our students? I think, like I said before, a lot of times we develop teams and we develop rules and we develop systems that are actually more geared towards supporting the adults and not geared enough towards supporting the needs of our students. And so making sure that we're constantly talking about, like, does this rule, does this system, does it exist to make an adult's life easier, but not necessarily translate to supporting our students in their learning and in feeling like they are at home when they're at school. Thinking about if your behavior team in its current form actually is minimizing the amount of suspensions of our students. And in tandem with that, also making sure that the behavior team is actually discussing issues of race and oppression, both in relation to suspensions, but as well as outside of, like, even just looking at referral numbers or the overall culture of the school building. An example I can give around that is sometimes I have seen schools develop systems that almost make it too easy for adults to refer students to the discipline process. And so I was recently in a school where I was walking around with an assistant principal who seemed to be the lead of their behavior team, and he was frequently checking his phone. And what he told me is they had created a system where teachers, if they're having a behavior issue in class that they didn't feel like they could handle within the classroom, could use GChat to send a quick message saying, you know, this student, this classroom, and they could either say respect, responsibility, or safety. Which of these three categories of our school values does it fall under? And the assistant principal would run to that classroom, pull that student, have the conversation with the student, and get them back into the seat. And what they didn't realize is they had made it so easy that the teacher actually never even had to have a conversation with the student before the student was removed from the classroom by a member of the behavior team. And they never had to repair any relationship that was harmed or talk about impact or hear what the student side of the story was, because everything was being done by this outside person who then brought the student back to class, made sure they were re-engaged, and stepped out. And as you can imagine, they would frequently see the same behavior, then repeated it when the student came back into the classroom. And so as the behavior was repeated, it usually escalated the student down a consequence ladder that eventually led to suspension. And so thinking about the systems that we're creating in our schools, are we creating systems that just make it super easy for adults to communicate with one another, but don't necessarily meet the need of the student who might be escalated or really struggling in a certain classroom? Thinking about, is your behavior team really facilitating the shift from reactive discipline to preventative community building? I would say if you outline what you think the different roles of the members of your behavior team are and everybody is involved in putting out fires, then you probably aren't making that shift. And so how can you restructure the roles of some of the people on your team in order to facilitate that? Thinking about what guiding questions or agenda items lead to a more productive behavior team meeting. Maybe at your school, there's a certain question that frequently gets the team in a mindset where they are ready to problem solve and really come up with creative solutions versus one that really has people shut down. And so making sure that you're adjusting your questions so that they're creating the most productive space possible. And then also make sure that you're communicating effectively with people that aren't on your behavior team, aren't present at behavior team meetings around those agenda items. And then finally, you can use this process as a way to develop some action steps about how you can slowly start to shift the way that this team operates within your school building. And so I hope this has been helpful in letting you see the different ways a behavior team can function to make sure that it is not just a reactive space and a space that is punitive to student, but instead becomes a space that is around figuring out ways to support our young people and meeting expectations, and also that supports adults and helping students meet the expectations that are within a school building.
Thank you so much, Allison. As always, such a really great webinar and such great information. So I neglected to say this at the beginning. We do have some questions in queue, but for folks who haven't been on a webinar with us before, I just want to talk through quickly how you can ask a question. So if you're online or even if you're on your smartphone, there should be a box where you can ask questions. And so you can type your question in that box. If you have my cell phone number, which if you've ever received an email from me, chances are you do have it. You can also text me a question because we are unable to accept questions from people who simply call in on the phone. The only way that the system allows us to accept questions is by folks who kind of log in through their computer or smartphone. So I have at least one text message already, and there are 3 questions in the queue already for you, Allison. One of them was asked early on, and so you did cover it. Are classroom teachers members of the behavioral team or is this team the same as the student support staff, i.e. deans, social workers, or restorative approaches coordinators?
Yeah, so I would say I would have as many stakeholders as possible be part of your behavior team, even if it means that they can't be at every meeting, but that the door is always open for them to come in and voice what's going on in their school. And again, I think that a lot of times these teams are already existing in a lot of different spaces. And so you might have that mental health support team that meets regularly, the dean and a restorative approaches coordinator that meets regularly, but making sure as much as possible you're bringing those groups together, or at least making sure they're communicating in a very effective way with one another.
Thank you. So the next question was about the manual, asking if the manual is available for download today as a starting point for other school districts. So we'll say, like, the really nice thing I think about this particular webinar and the information that Allison provided this evening is that no matter where you are in your work, this is a real foundational element of the work that you must do within your school community. And so if you are just beginning the idea of thinking through how you can implement restorative justice within your building, you do need a team of people. If you already started that journey and you don't have a behavior team yet, this is just such an important element of what you need. So after the, later on this week, we will send out the recording of this webinar, a lot of the tools that Allison mentioned on ways to begin the process of starting a behavior team and a plan that will walk you through that. We'll send out an example of Skinner's Prevention and Intervention Manual, which is the manual that Allison referenced during the webinar. And then we will also send out, which will probably, if we send it out this week, will only be in draft form, so it'll be without our design on it, a guide that Allison wrote to create a prevention and intervention manual. So really outlining some of the steps, for example, that Skinner took when it was deciding to work through this process. Allison, did you want to add anything to that?
The only thing I want to add is I think that the sample from Skinner can be, like the question had asked, a really good starting off point. But I would give the caveat that if you take Skinner's manual and you walk in and you try to implement it in your school, it probably won't take, because it's the process by which Skinner's is created that makes it such a powerful tool. And so that is the idea behind also sharing a facilitator's guide for how you might also be able to create something like this that is unique to the needs and the community in your school building.
So that's important enough to repeat as a reminder. Please don't take Skinner's manual and just use it within your school community. It will not work. Skinner staff built that manual specifically for their school community, and the guide that Allison created to kind of walk you through the steps to create your own, will allow you to build and create a manual that is unique to your school community. So again, just so I know we do a lot of sharing information and education, we don't want to do something like that in this case. So lots of text message questions. The first one was about SROs. And so Allison, during the webinar, mentioned having security SROs as part of the behavior team. So I responded to this person through text message because they were concerned specifically about school resource officers who may not be employees of the school district, but employees of the police department. And so there's this question comes up a lot, or this point comes up a lot, especially these days when we're seeing an increased call for more law enforcement officers in schools, and specifically those that may not be employees of the school district, but outside government agencies. And so an ongoing issue with sharing student information with law enforcement officers has been a FERPA violation. And so if you are going to include, this is different than obviously if the school employs a security officer. I know a lot of security officers who work for the school system who are employed at the school. They know those children. They work with those children over the course of a number of years. They have their own relationships with those children. Those are employees of the school district. as opposed to officers who may be employed of the outside police department, in which case you do have to be careful when sharing student information because of FERPA. Allison, did you want to add anything to that?
The only thing I would add is that I definitely understand the importance of keeping student information confidential from the SROs, but I think it can be really powerful when schools at least keep SROs informed about the overall school vision that they hope for their students and how they want to respond to behaviors. I will say that, like Dwana said, since a lot of SROs don't report to like the school administrators as their supervisor or their boss, it can't always be incredibly effective, but I have worked in buildings where it makes a big difference if the SRO at least understands what you're trying to do in your building. And so I've worked in schools with SROs and worked with schools with SROs who will make sure that behaviors are handled by the school and not by themselves, because they understand that the restorative work that school has as their goal. And then I've also worked in schools where the SRO is so disengaged from what the school is doing that they are out issuing tickets and things of that nature, when I do feel like if this particular SRO that I'm thinking about had been looped in more, they might have been more willing to refer things to the school rather than dealing with them as the SRO in the building. And so I completely understand not wanting to share, not sharing student information, but also thinking about how can you then include that SRO in your overall school vision.
Yep. So if you're a restorative school and you have a punitive officer, those two things don't go together. So make sure that if you have officers in your building, that they understand the philosophy of the school community. Okay. NPR had a recent article on push-in. Have you heard of this intervention process? And if so, what do you think about it? I haven't heard of it. Allison, have you?
I have not. I've not read that NPR article. I will say that I have a couple schools that are really changing their model as far as how their behavior team operates, and Skinner Middle School is actually one of those schools. And so rather than students being referred out of the classroom, if there is like something that is like some sort of behavior that is disruptive to other students' learning that's happening within the classroom, the first step is always that a member of the behavior team actually goes to the classroom and works with the student inside the classroom as much as possible, so that the student is not being pulled and missing class time. And so they have had a lot of success. I'm not sure if that's what the NPR article was in reference to. One thing I will say is that takes a lot of teacher buy-in. And so making sure that teachers understand if you are going to shift that model to you can no longer send a student who might be being disruptive to the learning of other students in your classroom out of the room, making sure that there is a real support that teachers are getting if they are put in that situation. And so that might be training that teachers are going through, like de-escalation strategies. It might be that a human being physically shows up to their room within a certain number of minutes to help support them. But I have seen that in a school that might not be ready for that shift yet, it can really undermine what you're trying to do, because it really turns teachers off to being part of a restorative school.
So yes, Allison, what you described was pushing that staff goes into the classroom for low-level incidents. Okay.
And they do have a lot of success at Skinner with that.
Okay, great. So next question, what outside community members are involved in the behavior team?
So some of the examples I can think of at schools that I've worked at would be like a drug interventionist that might be funded through a community organization. Sometimes I've been at schools where if there is a certain like volunteer group that is very present in the school building, they might be involved as well. So there's a couple local organizations here in Denver that are mostly like retired volunteers that come in and support students in one-on-one reading intervention. And so maybe the point person for that organization at your school might be involved in the behavior team, because they might frequently be working with students who are pretty highly students that are really struggling with the material who then also exhibit behavior concerns because of how much they're struggling with the material that they're working on. And so sometimes the lead for that person, that organization might be on a behavior team. And those are just two examples that come to mind.
Great. So our next question, how do you start a team when the principal is not restorative and leans toward authoritarian ways of dealing with staff, and that he probably likes the idea of a team of firefighters? Allison is probably the best person to answer this. It's really tough to start this work if you don't have a school leader that is bought into this shift. Obviously, we've seen examples of staff really kind of rallying together to push the leader, but it is just really difficult in a report that we released a number of years ago of some of the top things that you need in a school in order to create sustainable restorative justice practices. Staff building leadership, or a strong leader who believed in the vision and was committed to this vision, was one of the top points. So Allison, do you have any ideas about ways to do this work and to begin a team when the principal hasn't been bought in yet?
The only thing I think about is how can you create a team that will help with principal buy-in. And so if that means a small group of classroom teachers and support staff members that are willing to give up some time to get together to kind of collect and synthesize some data that you could then might be able to use to present to the principal about like why what we're doing right now isn't working. That would be one idea that I could think of. And also, even if on the flip side of that, if you have a team of people who go and start trying to implement more restorative practices in your school, who then are collecting survey data and testimonials that could convince the principal why this might be the direction that we should go. And so I know a couple schools, again, like Dwana said, there are groups of educators that are out there and being restorative in their own classrooms, even though they might not have the support of administration. But any way you can use a team of people to facilitate data collection so that you can make the case for why the principal should be bought in.
Thanks for that. I think also something that we've also suggested in the past is, what are some of the issues or measures that the principal is focused on, and making the tie between restorative justice and some of those measures. So if the principal is very focused on graduation rates, for example, showing the correlation between creating supportive schools that meet young people's needs and young people coming to school and then and doing well and then going on to graduate. So trying to kind of find what that hook is for your principal may be a way, and showing the correlation between restorative justice may be a way to get them to buy in. So we have another question. What is the easiest way to construct a behavior team in a school with a large volume of discipline problems?
I would think if you have a way, if you're, for example, a high school, if you have a way where you can make things more manageable by breaking them down by grade level, I think that can be really helpful. And so take advantage of some of the existing structures that might exist in your building. And so if you already have, ninth grade teachers getting together once a week, add an element in there where they're starting to have those conversations around trends that you're seeing, both on the side of adults and students, root cause that might be an issue, what kind of interventions have been successful and what haven't. And that way, by the time information gets to your overall behavior team, you kind of already had it sorted out by like 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade. Or if you're in middle school, maybe it's 6th through 8th grades. Maybe for elementary school, it's the, for upper elementary and lower elementary. But kind of taking advantage of those systems that already exist as a way to funnel more teased out information to the behavior team so that you can really focus on those big system conversations. And then also just really having somebody on your team that holds the team accountable to taking that step back. And so trying to, maybe you have every other meeting, you're not allowed to talk about individual students. Maybe every other meeting, you're only talking about trends. Because the reality is, if you spend all your time putting out fires and only talking about individual students, you probably will never see that larger cultural shift. And that will just become what your behavior team is for eternity. And so anything you can do to kind of balance the conversation so that you're Is there any way that you can kind of delegate the low-level conversations about individual students to other teams? And then are there ways that you can create almost like restrictions around your own team about when you're allowed to have those conversations and when you need to be talking about big picture and systems?
Thanks, Allison. So next question, you mentioned Skinner Middle School. What is the possibility of going to see their work? Well, as part of our Denver School-Based Restorative Practices Partnership, we do offer school visits to Skinner Middle School, North High School, and an elementary school in Denver who have a history of implementing restorative justice. We are obviously nearing the end of the school year, and so we do not have any more visits for this particular year. However, we will be releasing sometime over the summer our visit schedule for school year 18-19, and you will be able to find that schedule, I should say, on our website, which is denverrp.org. Also, chances are, if you're on this webinar, then you received an email from someone, either myself or maybe it was posted somewhere on. But there is some contact information that was shared once you register for the webinar. So if you just email me, we can also send out the list of visits, the schedule of visits once that's final. The next question, I would be interested in seeing the Skinner Middle School binder, yet I realized it was a process, a journey that the team at that school iterated over time. Is there another example or manual that we could view? So we will be sharing Skinner's manual and a guide, again, that Allison created to walk you through that manual. I don't know of any other examples offhand. Do you, Allison?
None that would be different enough that they would be worth sharing.
Okay. And at the moment, this is our last question, unless anyone else wanted to send in a question. What are some suggestions you have about involving student leaders in restorative practices?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely would say that would be something that would be highly encouraged. When I have asked the staff of Skinner, for example, about why they haven't involved students in the process over the summers, one thing that they do point out is that the space that they've created is a space where they build a lot of community among their adults. And so they actually involve students kind of at the end of the school year. The students give some feedback, and then at the beginning of the school year, the students review what the teachers did over the summer. I think it's really powerful if you have the ability to be able to involve students and their families as well in the process. I would highly encourage that. And just a note on the phrase student leaders, I think oftentimes we look to the same groups of students for input in a school community. So also challenging yourself around not just the student leaders, but also the students who are frequently referred to the office, who a lot of times don't end up in leadership positions, and what are their conversations like. I think it can be really valuable if you're not able to include students over the summer and their families to hold focus groups to talk about, which of our expectations are really difficult for you to meet, why might that be, what supports could be in place to help you meet this expectation, and really making sure that there's authentic student voice in this process. When Dwana sends out the facilitators manual that I wrote, I did include it as if students and families were included in the process. And so you'll kind of see what it could be like if you are able to bring students and families as part of this process as much as staff as part of the process.
Great. Okay, we have another question from an old friend that I haven't seen in a while. It's nice to see your name, Andrew. What are effective and creative, engaging ways to educate students and parents that the school is becoming restorative and is using restorative practices? So, I mean, for me, I know that especially when it comes to families, making sure that you are inclusive of families at the same time you're thinking about including educators. And so far too often we think about telling our families later on about what we're doing as we're training up our school staff. families need to be included in this process from the very beginning. Students need to be included in this process from the very beginning. I'm often asked, so like, when is the right time to reach out to young people and their families? And it's the same time that the school is making the decision to transition to the use of restorative justice. And that can be done in a lot of beautiful ways. When you think about inviting families into the school building, you could do that in circle. You could have parent meetings in circle. You could have back to school nights in circle. You could actually go out to the communities. So this isn't always about inviting families into the space, but also sometimes going to where they are. And so if the school community is starting to use restorative justice, and you know that on Saturday afternoons, a lot of the families gather at the community center to watch their children play sports. That may be a place where you can start this introduction. So it's not always that folks are coming to the school building, because that might not always be possible, but actually reaching them where they are. We always talk about making sure that when you're starting to use restorative justice, you do, especially the use of circles, you want to try to normalize circles in the school building. So you don't want circles or restorative justice to be seen as simply an alternative to suspension and expulsion. You do want some way to normalize circles. So there's nothing wrong with being in a circle. There's nothing wrong with restorative justice, that young people don't feel like they're being punished when they are participating in one of the practices. And the way to do that is to just start using circles all the time, teaching in circles, building community in circles. And although, we do focus heavily on including young people and families in the decision making, we also want to be clear that the school climate in the building is set by the adults in the building. And so whatever you are going to ask young people to do, the adults should be doing themselves. So even in the behavior team meetings, one thing I like about the guide that Allison puts together is that some of that work is actually done in circle. So you're using the very same process that you want to use within the school building to actually do some of the work to put the manual together. And so that could be staff meetings in circle. That could be professional learning community meetings in circle. So people are just getting to know each other and building the relationship with each other. So if and when it comes time to use restorative justice as tier 2 or tier 3 behavior following a suspension instead of a suspension, folks are not uncomfortable with the process. They understand what it is. They know what to do. And they also know that it's not a punishment. Allison, do you want to add anything?
I do not have anything to add.
Oh, this is just a nice thing. Just wanted to say thank you for the information, and we'll be looking forward to seeing what we send after the webinar. So I also just want to thank Allison for just another really great webinar on such an important topic. And I think a topic that is necessary, even if your school isn't implementing restorative justice, just to talk about how we're going to interact with young people and how we're going to respond to young people within our school building. And so before we close, I know Allison has a closing reading for us.
I do. I get asked to do a lot of presentations in elementary schools, and typically those are in the library. And the other day I was early for one and was flipping through a Shel Silverstein book, who was one of my favorite poets when I was growing up. And this is called The Voice by Shel Silverstein. There is a voice inside of you that whispers all day long, I feel that this is right for me. I know that this is wrong. No teacher, preacher, parent, friend, or wise man can decide what's right for you. Just listen to the voice that speaks inside.
So thank all of you for joining. As usual, we will share the recording of this webinar and all of the resources that Allison mentioned. Also, we got a final question. Yes, there are previous webinars. They've all been recorded. And so when I send out, when you get the link to this webinar, you will also get the folder to all of the previous webinars and the information that was shared therein. We thank you for joining us this evening for our webinar on restorative justice implementation. Be on the lookout for our final, sadly, webinar on restorative justice implementation for this school year, which will be on analyzing data. So a very, very important topic along with this one that is actually part of the work that this behavioral team will be undergoing. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you again, Allison, for everything.
Thank you.
Bye.